Oral questions. Questions orales. L'honorable député de Chicoutimi-Le-Fjord.
The honourable member for Chicoutimi-Le-Fjord. Mr. Speaker, the Liberal government says it uses diversity as the basis for its judicial selection process. Yesterday, the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Justice gave statistics to prove how diverse the appointments were. Diversity is very important, but the Liberalist system does nothing for political diversity. Why are the Liberals using diversity to hide their lies?
Yes.
The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the Honourable Member for his question, but the basic premise is completely false. When we were first elected in 2015, we put in place a more rigorous, transparent and responsible system that reflects the diversity of Canada and allows for the appointment of high-caliber judges to the bench. The appointments are based on merit and on the expertise of the various candidates and recommendations of the independent recommending bodies. We're proud of the appointments we've made, and the candidates come from the Honourable Member for Chicoutimi-Le-Fjord. Mr. Speaker, the government repeatedly uses words like inclusive and transparent to describe its judicial selection process. While these words sound nice, there's no basis for them in this government. Judges are appointed simply because they support the Liberal Party. And it's not transparent to make changes to the process only after these flaws have been exposed. When will this government start living up to the words it uses to describe itself?
Yes.
The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, the basic assumptions of the Honourable Member's question are false. Since 2015, we've implemented a system based on merit, which is independent. The advisory committees work in a neutral fashion. They're nonpartisan, and they do a good job in choosing candidates who will move forward in the appointment process. They're based on merit, and Mr. Speaker, we will not be lectured by the Conservative Party. They're the ones who actually are the reason for the changes we made in 2015. The Honourable Member for Chicoutimi-Le-Fjord. Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Justice and the Prime Minister have been defending their appointment process for quite some time now. But the Minister of Justice himself said that the process takes no partisan considerations into account. Well, we know today that that's completely false. The Liberalist system has added a filter to this process that makes the whole thing biased and partisan. How are Canadians supposed to trust a Minister of Justice who himself doesn't play by the rules? The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, as I just described, and we've done this many times, the advisory committees work independently at arm's length. They base their decisions on merit. We look at the merit and diversity. Those are our two criteria in choosing judges of high caliber all across Canada. Since 2015, we've appointed almost 450 people to the bench, Mr. Speaker. They're exceptional, outstanding lawyers from all backgrounds and all political affiliations, and will continue to do so.
The opposition.
Well, Mr. Speaker, last fall, the Justice Minister told the House, there's no partisanship in my decision-making process. But this week, senior government sources admitted that judicial appointments were checked against the Liberal supporter database Liberal list. Canadians expect judges that are appointed on merit, and those merits should not include how much money they donated to the Liberals or whether or not they took a lawn sign in the last election. Was the minister trying to mislead the House, or did he just forget the Liberal list has a veto on his appointments?
Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, again, the assumptions made by the honourable member are completely false, and I stand by what I said in previous responses. Mr. Speaker, we've put into place a process that is independent, it's clear, it's transparent. the judicial appointment committees work in a way, Mr. Speaker, that is completely nonpartisan. And I make my appointments, Mr. Speaker, based only on merit and diversity and not in a partisan fashion. And Mr. Speaker, we'll continue with the high quality appointments that we have made. We certainly will not take lessons from the Conservative Party. They're the reason why we put this system into place.
The Honourable Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Well, the minister should be hanging his head in shame and taking some lessons on how to make appointments that are not partisan. The minister posted a tweet congratulating one of his buddies, one of his donors, on the recent appointment. And then he had to take down the tweet because it turned out the approval wasn't official yet. Well, that's how Ottawa is run under these Liberals. If you donate enough to the Justice Minister or fly the Prime Minister's family around the world, you get concierge service from this government. Just how long have the Liberals been using their partisan supporter database to approve judges' appointments?
Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, again, the presumptions made by the honourable member are completely false, and I disagree with them. There was a mistake made in a tweet that was corrected, and by the department, and persons were contacted with respect to the mistake that was made. And again, I apologize for that mistake being made on behalf of the Ministry of Justice. Mr. Speaker, we appoint quality candidates from all political backgrounds, from all backgrounds, diverse backgrounds, Mr. Speaker, through a process that's independent, through a process that focuses on quality, on talent, and on diversity, Mr. Speaker. And
La députée de Saint-Jean.
The honourable member for Saint Jean. Mr. Speaker, yesterday the Liberals rejected a block motion condemning the conflation of the horrible attack in London with a Quebec piece of legislation. The member for Mississauga, Erin Mills, justified that rejection by creating a new conflation of her own. She said Canada is a multicultural society where everyone should feel welcome, and legislation like that in Quebec does not contribute to creating such a climate. So clearly for her, there's a connection between the attack in London and Quebec's legislation. Does the government agree with this position, or will they reprimand that member? The Honourable Minister.
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the honourable member for her question. I apologize for the technical glitch. The Quebecers, Mr. Speaker, are well aware. They're defending their rights through the Constitution, and we're going to continue to follow that process from close. Obviously, I express my condolences to the Muslim community in London and across Canada for this tragic and horrific act, and we will continue to move forward in that direction, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Saint Jean. Mr. Speaker, the motion the Liberals rejected had 3 points. It repeated our sincere condolences to the family and loved ones of the victims, as well as the entire community of London. And that's who we should be still talking about today, not political parties, and even less about Quebec. It repeated that this unspeakable violence and hatred must be condemned. And it repeated that we need to avoid conflating things inappropriately because this tragedy shouldn't be used for political or ideological purposes. How is it possible that this House cannot agree on that? The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, I cannot speak for the unanimity of the House. We have said from the outset that we expressed our condolences to the family and the loved ones, and to the community, the Muslim community all across Canada, and especially in London, Ontario. We are currently, Mr. Speaker, working on fighting Islamophobia, and we will continue to do that, Mr. Speaker, because that's what we must do in order to have an inclusive country, and I have to say so, a fair country.
This government's provided $750 billion in liquidity supports for Canada's big banks. It's provided billions to profitable companies who paid out dividends and executive bonuses. And it's refused to put into place a wealth tax or a pandemic's profits tax. For this government, the sky is the limit for the ultra-rich. but with a potential fourth wave coming and families struggling, why is this Liberal government slashing supports that Canadians desperately need to put food on the table? Why are Liberals slashing nearly in half emergency benefits for Canadians at this critical time?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, with great respect for the honourable member, I take with some umbrage with the question he's put. He knows fairly well that during this pandemic, it was our government who was there for people in need. We advanced record supports to help families keep food on the tables and help workers remain on the payroll. Going forward, we have immense benefits that we're rolling out to continue to support people and businesses through this pandemic. And I'll point out before he continues to ride on his high horse that when he had the opportunity to vote to cut taxes for the middle class and paying for them by raising them on the 1%, he voted against it. When he had the chance to stop sending childcare checks to millionaires to put more money in the pockets of 9 out of 10 Canadian families, he voted against it too. Families should know.
The honourable member for North Island, Powell River.
Mr. Speaker, let's be real. The Liberals offered 1,000 for the CERB, and it was the NDP that moved them to the 2,000. So I remind the minister of that. In the next 3 weeks, this government is cutting the CRB support to Canadians across the country almost in half. I'm asking the minister how they expect people to buy food, pay their rent, and cover their bills on $1,200. That doesn't pass the test in Canadian cities. This government gives billions of dollars to oil and gas companies. They refuse to tax the ultra-rich, but are fine to nickel and dime everyday people. Instead of working for the ultra-rich and huge corporations, when will this government step up and actually...
The honourable minister.
Mr. Speaker, I would urge the NDP to tone down the rhetoric and stop trying to take credit for the measures that our government put in place to help Canadians in their time of need. The very first thing we did when we came to office in 2015 was raise taxes on the wealthiest 1% so we could cut them for the middle class. The NDP voted against it. When we had a chance to stop sending childcare checks to millionaires to put more money in the pockets of 9 out of 10 Canadian families, the NDP voted against it. When we took initial steps to eliminate measures that benefit wealthy executives just in 2019, the NDP voted against it too. Canadians should know from the beginning of this pandemic till its end, we will be there.
The honourable member for Carleton.
Not only are millionaire corporate liberals like Mark Carney refusing to source raw materials from the Xinjiang region of China, which powers its production of those materials with slave labor and coal-fired manufacturing. Here in this government, they're refusing to rule out partnering with companies like iFlyTech, which does AI research to help identify the voice of Chinese political dissidents and carry out that very same genocide. Will the government reverse course and stop partnering with technology companies that enable genocide?
The honourable minister.
Mr. Speaker, look, we will partner with folks on the international stage, but it is rich for him to suggest that he is somehow more morally astute than the government. Our focus when it comes to the relationship with China is securing the release of the two Michaels, is the well-being of 300,000 Canadians in Hong Kong, is the treatment of the Uyghur population in Xinjiang. Mr. Speaker, we will continue to focus on Canada playing a leadership role on the world stage in defending the interests of Canadians abroad at every opportunity.
Member for Carleton.
He says he's concerned about the Uyghur Muslim minority in China. He refused to condemn the genocide being committed against that very population. And then he wags his fingers at us. Now, the question was very specific. The federal government is funding research at universities that are now partnering with companies like iFlyTech, which is using voice recognition technology that helps the Chinese government intercept the phone calls of the Uyghur population to identify what they're saying and help carry out the genocide. If he's as moral as he claims, why won't he rule out any further of those types of partnerships?
Hear, hear. Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we have been very clear with respect to the treatment of the Uyghurs in China, and we are gravely preoccupied with all of the very credible reports that have come out of China with respect to their treatment. That is why we have been calling for an open, unfettered, impartial investigation of the situation in Xinjiang, and we will continue to press for that with our international partners.
Well, member for Carleton.
Well, speaking of our international partners, the U.S. State Department has blacklisted iFlyTech because of its role in supporting the genocide in Xinjiang region. The Australians have recognized the company likewise, and recently the Alberta government has called for a national policy that bans technological cooperation with companies like this one that aid in the commission of genocide. Will the government announce today no more funding partnerships with technology companies that help commit genocide?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we have been clear in recent months that cooperation with other countries, including China, that may involve a risk with respect to intellectual property are to be taken into consideration when funding partnerships are proposed in our universities and other institutions. That is something that we're very conscious of, and the Minister of Innovation, Science and Industry has spoken about it recently.
The honourable member for Louis Saint Laurent. Mr. Speaker, every day for weeks we've been calling on the government to shed light on events at the Winnipeg laboratory. The government's response has always been the same. They call us racist, and yesterday they called us conspiracy theorists, confirming that insults are still the weapon of the weak. Yesterday, the CBC, yes, the CBC, mentioned national security experts who also want to get to the bottom of this. And they're even talking about espionage. Why is the government refusing to get to the bottom of this? The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I think the Conservative member opposite knows full well by now that we have provided NSI COP fully unredacted documents. This is the appropriate committee, Mr. Speaker, to investigate these documents, and I urge him to stop accusing the government of not being transparent, because in fact, by providing fully unredacted documents, that's exactly what we're being, transparent.
The honourable member for Louis Saint Laurent. This is a secret committee we're talking about, and ultimately the Prime Minister has the last word. It's not a parliamentary committee. It's a committee created by the Liberal government, made up of parliamentarians, and we voted against it precisely because there's no transparency. The best way to get to the bottom of things and to meet the concerns of the experts we heard yesterday on CBC is to allow those documents to be tabled here and to be studied by a real parliamentary committee. Why won't the government allow this? The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the opposition party is playing dangerous games with national security. He knows, the member knows fully well that, in fact, their party appoints candidates to the NSI COP. The documents are with the committee. They are fully unredacted. I encourage him to stop trying to mislead Canadians and play games with national security.
The honourable member for Louis Saint Laurent. Mr. Speaker, what happened in Winnipeg? 2 researchers were escorted out by the RCMP. A security clearance was given to one researcher who was directly connected with the Chinese army. Unexplained, 2 senior directors of the lab departed with no explanation, and 2 viruses were sent from Winnipeg to Wuhan. These are important questions. We want to know why all this happened, and by a parliamentary committee, not by a committee created by the Prime Minister, a real parliamentary committee. Why is the government hiding the truth from Canadians? The Honourable Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, a committee that is comprised of parliamentarians from both houses and across all parties is indeed a parliamentary committee. I would say that, Mr. Speaker, it's important that the member opposite not try to mislead Canadians, not try to play chicken with national security. This is not a game, Mr. Speaker. Those documents have been provided to the committee, fully unredacted, in a place where it is safe to review them.
The honourable member for Joliette. I'd like to draw the attention of the business community in Quebec to this. Bill C-30 with this bill, the Bloc cut funding to the office responsible for setting up a Canada-wide securities regulator. And this was a small victory, but a great relief for our economy. We've been fighting for 40 years to prevent the federal government from destroying Montreal's financial sector in favor of Toronto. But the battle's not won. The Liberals are trying to bring back the funding. Will they withdraw their amendment, or do they want to pick another fight with Quebec over securities? The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, the transition office in question will support efforts to establish financial markets securities regulator. We want to provide funding to that office to continue federal efforts to establish a cooperative regulatory regime for financial markets, and that's a good thing for everyone. The Honourable Member for Joliette. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to congratulate the Parliamentary Secretary on his French. Congratulations, but not for what he said, because that's bad news for Quebec's economy. Everyone knows that the Liberals look at the election calendar like a child looks at a cookie jar. So I don't understand why they're reigniting the battle over securities with C-30. I don't understand why they want to go to war with Quebec's business community at a time when our businesses want to focus on recovery. I don't understand why they're willing to fight for funding for an office that serves no purpose if the Liberals respect Quebec jurisdiction. Are the Liberals so intent on destroying Montreal's financial centre? The Honourable Minister. We fully understand Quebec's position and Quebec's jurisdiction. There have been constructive discussions between the minister and his Quebec counterpart. I think it's good to do things that help us have a joint economy. For example, when it comes to interprovincial trade, there's an opportunity to fight against money laundering as well. This is a good idea for the whole country, Mr. Speaker.
Member for Thornhill.
Religious, ethnic, and cultural communities are hurting. In recent weeks, we've seen toxic hate on social media and in our streets. We've seen hate-driven vandalism, violence, and murder. Mr. Speaker, Canadians expect members of this House and the parties they represent to calm, not inflame intercommunal discord and discrimination. Why then have the Liberals welcomed a floor-crossing MP disciplined by her former party for inflammatory, misguided, and intemperate remarks against Israel?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, our government will always work to ensure that we work with all Canadians. And the member recognizes that Canadians are hurting right now. It's been a very challenging couple of weeks and actually months and years. We know that there is quite the racist history within Canada, and right now is the time for us to work together. And that's why we have Canada's anti-racism strategy. That's why we are having conversations with all groups, because it will take every single Canadian from coast to coast to coast to counter hate, because hate does not belong in Canada. And I hope the member will join us in this much needed battle. Thank you, Mr.
Go back to the Honourable Member for Thornhill, but just ask that he might raise the boom on his headset just slightly, just to improve the sound. The Honourable Member for Thornhill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And to that non-answer, let me offer the reaction of an honourable former colleague of this House, Michael Levitt, now CEO of the Friends of Simon Wiesenthal Centre for Holocaust Studies. As a former Liberal MP, he writes, "I'm disappointed and concerned by the news that the MP for Fredericton has crossed the floor to join the Liberal caucus, given her inflammatory, one-sided and divisive rhetoric during the recent conflict between Israel and the terror group Hamas." Mr. Speaker, is this Liberal government really so desperate in its rush to attempt re-election?
I'm not so sure that the question is actually a matter for the operational elements of the government. I do see that the minister is rising to response. We'll go to him, the Honourable Minister, if he wishes to respond.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I will simply say that the position of the Liberal government is extremely clear on the question of the apartheid label. We reject it categorically. It is not part of our approach with respect to the Israel or the Jewish community. And we, of course, are completely against any anti-Semitism that would be displayed by any Canadian citizen.
Honourable member for Aurora Oak Ridges, Richmond Hill.
Mr. Speaker, Canada has a national housing crisis, and it's getting worse. With the lowest per capita housing supply in the G7, Canada simply does not have enough houses. In my GTA riding, housing prices have skyrocketed by over 25% in the last year, with the average price now over $1 million. Canadians can't find places to live, and they are losing hope that they will ever own a home. When will the government take real action to help Canadians achieve a more secure housing future?
Honourable Minister.
Well, thank you very much for that question. I will note that the Conservative member who asked it has proposed taxing your primary residence and changing the capital gains tax. That was alerted to the House in debate earlier this week, which is an astonishing reversal of position for the Conservatives. But we also have done a number of different things. For example, the tax on vacant homes and offshore ownership, in terms of beneficial ownership and new rules around the disclosure to help fight money laundering, as well as our $72 billion national housing strategy. And to put this in perspective, in the last 6 months through the Rapid Housing Initiative, we have secured and built more homes in 6 months than the previous Conservative government did in their last 2 years. And with
the honourable member for Aurora Oak Ridges, Richmond Hill.
Well, Mr. Speaker, when it comes to the national housing crisis, it's about the facts. Monthly mortgage prices have increased by an average of $330 to $2,500. For many in the GTA, the cost of housing exceeds 75% of their income, and owning a home is out of reach as it takes over 277 months to save for a down payment. The Royal Bank says calls for forceful action to cool the frenzied real estate market have been mostly ignored. When will the government act to make housing?
The Honourable Minister.
This government has been acting since the day we took office in 2015. A $72 billion investment into the housing sector delivers market rental solutions to families so they can rent cheaper and therefore save to get into the housing market. Our first-time home buyers program has helped more than 10,000 Canadians acquire their first property. Our move to end chronic homelessness, as I said, has delivered 4,770 units of housing in the last 6 months, which is almost exactly what the Conservatives did over the last 2 years in office. But we did it while also maintaining subsidies for co-ops, also building new housing, also repairing housing, and also making sure that the Reaching Home dollars got more than doubled. In fact, are now at $500 million a year for the next 3 years. Our government's record in housing is clear. The Conservatives' lack of leadership
the honourable member for Edmonton Strathcona.
Last month, Edmontonians grieved the deaths of 3 men who died in a downtown park in broad daylight after suspected overdose. In 2020, Alberta had record numbers of drug-related deaths. In 2021, this horrifying trend continues. EMS responded to 55 overdose calls in just 48 hours last week. The UCP have cut safe injection sites and funding, and this week they announced a nasal naloxone pilot, a move experts say is a redundant distraction and not enough to respond to the crisis. The federal government is piloting SUAP safe supply pilots in other provinces. Why not in Alberta?
Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, first of all, let me just say that I share the member opposite's dismay at attacks on treating substance use as a health condition and not one of criminality. And that's in fact what our government has done since we were elected in 2015. We have restored harm reduction to the Canada drug strategy. We have ensured that communities across the country from coast to coast have access to funding for harm reduction and other treatment options. We'll continue to provide funding, including through the money in Budget 2021, to community-based programs that treat substance users with dignity and with hope. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Member for Skeena-Bulkley Valley.
Mr. Speaker, Canada is the only country in the G7 without a restart plan for international travel. For some small tourism operators in Northwest BC, more than 90% of their clients come from the U.S. They've already lost one tourism season, and many have had to use their savings to keep their staff on. If there's a chance they can salvage part of the coming tourism season, they need time to prepare. The government needs to explain its plan to begin lifting travel restrictions safely. Can the minister tell Canadians what restrictions will apply to fully vaccinated travelers?
The Honourable Minister.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank my colleague for that question. As he knows, protecting health and safety of Canadians will always be the top priority. During the pandemic, we have taken measures for travelers, including tests prior to and after arrival, and we have taken a progressive or gradual approach to adjust measures as we have science-based information. We are working in close collaboration with international partners in order to talk about a coordinated approach for an eventual resumption of travel in all security.
Scarborough Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, last Sunday, the community of London, Ontario, was the site of an atrocious act of terrorism. 4 lives were lost, taken, and a child was left in the hospital. All this loss because a visible Muslim family went for a walk and someone filled with hate killed them. Many Canadian Muslims are once again living with fear that they too could be targeted simply for being a Muslim. This is unacceptable. Mr. Speaker, can the Minister of Diversity and Inclusion and Youth please tell this House how our government is tackling Islamophobia to create a safer and more inclusive...
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, our hearts go out to the loved ones of the Afzal family and to Fayaz, who remains in hospital. Our government knows we need to act against Islamophobia. We are doing this through Canada's anti-racism strategy, adding white supremacist groups to Canada's terror listing, increased funding to protect places of worship and community spaces. But more is needed, which is why we will lead national summits on combating all forms of hate, including a national summit on combating Islamophobia, also advocated for by the hardworking member for Scarborough Centre. We will continue to work with partners to tackle all forms of hate in Canada and to create a safer and more inclusive Canada for all. Thank you, Mr.
Honourable Member for Calgary Midnapore.
Mr. Speaker, NAV Canada handed out $7 million in bonuses. This is after laying off 700 workers and increasing airline fees by 30%. These emergency funds were meant to keep workers employed, not to hand out to executives. Will the minister start standing up for Canada's aviation workers and demand that these bonuses are paid back?
Honourable Minister. The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, it is completely unacceptable for companies to be extending bonuses to wealthy executives when they are in receipt of public money designed for workers. I'm pleased to share with the honourable member that we have designed the program in a way that's going to help combat this particular trend. In particular, I would point out that companies need to prove with the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy that every penny they claim is actually going to its workers. In addition, we've adopted a new rule with respect to Budget 2021 that will see any company that increases its executive compensation going forward beyond pre-pandemic levels, they will be required to pay monies back received through the wage subsidy. These benefits are for workers, and that's where they should go.
The Honourable Member for Montmagny, Kamouraska, Rivière-du-Loup. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Regional airlines have been hard hit by the COVID-19 pandemic, and if things weren't bad enough, Transport Canada has added insult to injury by asking MH Aviation in my riding to pay $544 for a simple address change. $544. Does the Minister of Transport feel it's acceptable for his department to behave like Scrooge McDuck with a company that's already on its knees to reprint a certificate that costs almost nothing to produce? The Honourable Minister.
Oui, merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank my colleague for that question. I want to reassure him that our government is dedicated to ensuring that all the regions have sustainable, effective, affordable services. We want to ensure that all individuals in all the regions will be well served, and I would be pleased to work with my colleague on this specific issue that he is talking about today.
The Honourable Member for Kenora.
Mr. Speaker, now that provinces are reopening, our top priority must be on an economic recovery in all sectors and all regions of the country. But this government has done nothing to help small businesses and tourist outfitters in northwestern Ontario who are struggling to maintain operations and have now lost the better part of 2 summers. They need hope that they will open to a thriving economy. So, Mr. Speaker, when will this government give them that hope and present a real plan for an economic recovery?
Honourable Minister.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Obviously, I don't agree with my colleague because we've been there since the beginning of the pandemic to help our different regions, and in particular Northern Ontario, to make sure that businesses have access to different measures to survive the pandemic, particularly our tourism operators. They've had access to the wage subsidy, to the CEBA accounts, to the support through FedNor. And we've been there to make sure that they can continue to operate in these very difficult times, and we'll continue to support them in the future, as we will be investing more than $1 billion to support them in the coming months.
Well, member for St. Albert, Edmonton.
Mr. Speaker, as life returns to normal in countries such as the US and the UK, here in Canada, this government has offered no plan to reopen the economy, no plan to end the disastrous hotel quarantines, and no plan to see a return to normalcy. Enough is enough. After 15 months of failed COVID policy after failed COVID policy, why is it that this government's only plan is to keep Canadians locked down forever?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I find it rich every time the Conservatives put on record their opposition to sensible public health measures that are not only designed to keep Canadians safe, but to protect the long-term interest of our economy as well. Our plan from the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic was to do everything we can to protect Canadians from the public health emergency. I'd point the honourable member to the fact that Canada is now #1 in the OECD of any country in terms of the number of citizens who've received their first dose. We're going to continue to support businesses so they can punch out of this pandemic recession by extending the emergency benefits, by putting in place new measures to encourage businesses to hire more Canadians, and to make sure that all Canadians from different walks of life get to benefit from the profound economic growth that private sector economists are projecting for Canada this year. A year from now, his comments on the record today will look
The Honourable Member for Manicouagan, Mr. Speaker. The federal government is abandoning fisheries facilities in Grand Riviere and Gaspé. The government of Quebec is asking Ottawa to fund the winter boat storage for fishing vessels, but Ottawa is refusing to expand the fisheries fund, despite that fact that only $5 of $42 million in the fund have been spent over the past 2 years. Mr. Speaker, Grand Riviere and the MRC are mobilizing for the fishermen. The government of Quebec is doing the same. 50% of the landings are in the Gaspé. Economic development in the region is in danger. Where is the member and the minister for Gaspé, the islands? The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, if we want to talk about leadership, I have no lessons to take from the Bloc Québécois, which completely devitalized the Gaspé for 15 long years. The Bloc is not able to do anything in the regions except complain. In the Gaspé, we need people who do things, not complain. Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Member for Manicouagan. Mr. Speaker, I hope that the people in Gaspé, the islands, will hear what the Minister is saying today. It's in Grand River, Gaspé, that the federal government is failing both the fishermen and undermining the economy. This spring, it was Cap-aux-Îles in the Magdalen Islands with its abandoning of the fisheries facilities in the middle of the fishing season. Throughout the region, the federal government is abdicating its responsibilities. It makes no sense. If the federal government isn't there to support the fishery in eastern Quebec, where is it? Can the member for Gaspé, the islands, do anything? How is it possible that she cannot make her minister colleagues understand that? The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, while the Bloc is playing to the gallery, we on this side of the House, we are delivering concrete results for Quebecers. The Bloc says they're speaking on behalf of the Gaspé Peninsula. Where's the Bloc's record? How many jobs did they create in the Gaspé? Mr. Speaker, I can tell you that in the Gaspé, with those kinds of opinions, we don't need any enemies.
Brandon Souris.
Mr. Speaker, last week, a family from Virden, Manitoba took their son to an eye specialist in North Dakota due to his condition. Their son had a referral from a doctor in Canada, but when they returned across the border into Canada, they were slapped with a fine of $10,000. Mr. Speaker, this is absurd given the Prime Minister has just exempted NHL players, but thinks it's, he's willing to fine a mom and a dad $10,000 to take their son to a medical appointment. So I'm asking the Minister of Finance, or the Minister of Health, or the Minister of Public Safety to intervene and fix this injustice.
Fix it.
Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I encourage the member opposite to contact my office with the specifics of this particular case, and I'd be happy to look into it for him. In general, though, I will say that the measures at the border are there to protect Canadians from the importation of the virus, and we encourage all Canadians to follow the rules. But I will look into this particular case for the member.
Honourable Member for Langley, Aldergrove.
Mr. Speaker, I've heard from so many constituents who tell me that the mandatory hotel quarantine program of this government makes no sense. It's expensive, and given the lack of supporting data, people are not convinced that it is better than a stay-at-home order. I've recently heard from a constituent who's doing humanitarian work overseas as a volunteer, who's not been able to be fully vaccinated, and who cannot afford this government's inflated prices for a hotel room on her return. When will this government scrap this botched program?
Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, our measures of protection of the border have been guided through science and evidence to ensure that we protect Canadians from the importation of the virus. We'll continue to adjust border measures as the science and evidence and advisors recommend to do so. Listen, Mr. Speaker, over the last year and a half, Canadians have made tremendous sacrifice in their lives. Small businesses have struggled. Individual families have sacrificed. We can see the finish line, Mr. Speaker. It's important that we are careful and cautious on our next steps.
Well, member for Bow River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The COVID-19 Testing and Screening Expert Advisory Panel has officially recommended doing away with the failure of the Liberal hotel quarantine policy. Instead, the Liberals increased fines for non-compliance, and only the day before the Prime Minister left for the UK was it modified. When will this government immediately end, not simply modify, when this non-science-based program, when will it be gone?
Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, before I answer that question, let me just say that any kind of allegation that the Prime Minister is not complying with the measures that are in place for all Canadians is untrue. And in terms of the progress on alleviation of border measures, we'll be guided by science and evidence on this side of the House, Mr. Speaker. As I've said, Canadians have made extraordinary sacrifices to fight this virus. We see the finish line. Canadians are stepping up to get vaccinated. By the way, Mr. Speaker, first in the G7, the G20, and the OECD for first shots. We're on our way, Mr. Speaker. It's important that we protect our progress.
The Honourable Member for Saint-Laurent. Mr. Speaker, we said it a number of months ago, and we have repeated it many times. There is a vaccination plan, and the plan is working. We told Canadians that we would be there for them and that we would face the pandemic together, and that is what we have done. Despite those who have chosen to sow fear and uncertainty, there is no doubt, Mr. Speaker, Quebecers are already making their appointments for a second dose. Can the minister give more information about the vaccine supply and the future of vaccine supply? The Honourable Minister. I thank the member for Saint-Laurent, who is right to say that the results speak for themselves.
Canadians are rolling up their sleeves. Today, over 72% of eligible Canadians have received at least one dose, putting Canada first in the G7, the G20, and the OECD. Our announcement of over 7 million Moderna doses next week brings next week's deliveries to a total of 9.5 million doses, Mr. Speaker. C'est ce que nous rejetons depuis le début.
We have a plan that is working, and that's what we've been saying since the beginning.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I've been contacted by numerous municipalities in my riding regarding their applications to the Investing in Canada Infrastructure Program. Unfortunately, many of them have been receiving the cold shoulder from the federal government and have not heard back on the status of their applications as they watch other projects across this country being announced. As the minister knows, time is running out for the municipalities to start construction. When will the municipalities in my riding of Elgin Middlesex London be able to announce and begin construction on these projects?
Honourable Minister.
I'd like to thank the member opposite for her question. She can rest assured that we have been approving thousands of projects across the country. Since the pandemic, we every day are moving forward on projects. Projects have been delayed because we haven't received them from the province, but we are turning them around as quickly as possible. I'm certainly happy to follow up with the member and also remind her of all the investments that we have made in her community. It is critically important that shovels are in the ground. We also need to be creating jobs, tackling climate change, and building more inclusive communities.
Honourable member for Renfrew, Nipissing, Pembroke.
Mr. Speaker, media reports say soldiers who raised concerns during Op Impact have been interviewed by the military police. The Defence Minister and Parliamentary Secretary say the allegations into Iraqi war crimes are troubling and an investigation must occur. Now, we know this minister is allergic to conducting investigations. He even pushed back from the table to avoid seeing evidence. Will this minister confirm that an investigation is underway into the motive behind the cover-up of the allegations of war crimes that occurred during this Prime Minister's watch?
The Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Our government is committed to respecting and upholding human rights, international and domestic law, and the dignity of all persons. These disturbing allegations, I can confirm, are under investigation by the Canadian Forces National Investigation Service. The Canadian Armed Forces is no longer operating with the elements of the Iraqi security forces involved in these allegations. We are taking this matter very seriously. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for West Nova.
Mr. Speaker, talking about the weather is truly Nova Scotian, and weather radar is an important tool for farmers and fishers alike, allowing them to plan and make sure that they and their workers are safe. Currently, a big chunk of southwest Nova Scotia, the most lucrative fishing grounds in Canada, are not covered by weather radar. And tomorrow, the existing radar in mainland Nova Scotia will be offline for months, creating more uncertain forecasts. Can the minister commit to not only quick replacement of the Gore facility, but an expansion that will finally cover all Nova Scotians to make sure that our citizens are safe on land and on sea?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, it is obviously important that fishers in all regions of this country have the tools that they need to not only stay safe, but to protect their livelihoods. And I am more than willing to talk to this particular member immediately after question period about this particular piece of equipment.
The Honourable Member for St. John, Rothsay.
Mr. Speaker, Canadians with a criminal record face barriers long after serving their sentence. For those just trying to get ahead, it became even more difficult when the Harper Conservative government created more barriers to accessing a pardon, such as by increasing the cost by 1,200%. In 2018, this House agreed to adopt my motion for the Public Safety Committee to study this problem, and the report found that having a pardon increases access to a job, education, stable housing, and makes communities safer by helping to end the cycle of crime. Can the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Public Safety please give us an update on how the government is working to make
the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And first, I'd like to thank the member for St. John Rothsay for all he's done over the years in advocating for pardon reform. The presence of a criminal record has led to Indigenous, Black, and other racialized communities being disproportionately represented in our criminal justice system. These records create barriers to accessing a job, housing, and education, which can in turn perpetuate the cycle of crime. Yesterday, we introduced legislation to reduce barriers in accessing a pardon and allow law-abiding citizens to safely reintegrate into their communities. This is a smart approach to crime, and we thank the Public Safety Committee for their essential work in bringing this about. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Rosemount Petit Patrie. Jatinder Singh is an Indian truck driver who lives in Park Extension. He is an essential worker who provided much-needed services throughout the pandemic. He will be deported on June 15th, 5 days from now. If he goes back to India, he is afraid for his life due to his political activism. India is also going through the middle of a raging wave of COVID-19. His health is in danger, and border services indicated that it would not deport essential workers. Where is the Liberal compassion? Are they so heartless? Will the minister commit to intervening in this file, yes or no? The Honourable Minister. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We understand that decisions on immigration cases can have a deep impact on the health and safety and lives of individuals. Each case is assessed based on the merits in a fair way, consistent with Canadian legislation. Every case is assessed based on its own circumstances. I cannot discuss the details of a specific case due to privacy laws.
For Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Earlier this week, the report on the killing of Chantal Moore was made public. It doesn't add up. There were no actual witnesses. There's no video recordings. There's no audio recordings. The physical evidence doesn't really support the officer's story. His story that he feared for his life as a petite 26-year-old Indigenous woman came at him with a knife. The knife, not found near her body, no fingerprints, and found under a box. Can the Minister of Indigenous Services give this House some hope that we will get to the bottom of this and that wellness checks will stop resulting in the death of Indigenous people? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And first and foremost, our thoughts are with the family and friends of Chantal Moore through these difficult times. Following the tragic passing of Ms. Moore after an interaction with the Edmundston Police Service, the Minister has spoke with the New Brunswick Regional Chief and President of the New Chenoweth Tribal Council to discuss wellness checks and the different roles of police in our communities. In situations such as these, it's essential that there be a timely, transparent, and independent investigation in order to provide answers to the many difficult but important questions that people have. While questions about the investigation and findings should be directed to the province, we continue our important work of modernizing police structures, updating standards regarding use of force, and establishing increased oversight of law enforcement.